wanted to start, speaking of integral people, you often credit Bill Powers, who our former UT president who passed away last month. You always would credit him and said that this project wouldn't really have happened without him. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about his leadership.
Yeah, actually, I took this picture in Bill's office, in the president's office, of Jack. I took Jack Shear, this is Ellsworth Kelly's husband, partner, head of the foundation now, over to see him. Obviously the role of the museum and Ellsworth were the two kind of fundamental, very visible roles, but it's the people behind the scenes, and this picture is perfect because both Bill and Jack were, without them it would not have happened for many reasons. Jack supporting Ellsworth and Bill supporting me and the Blanton. Universities are very large, very complicated, very political, very, just complex institutions, and this is a public university. Getting a project of this scale done on this campus in the way it needed to get done, I couldn't have gotten it done had I not had a president that just from day one, offered me his support. You have to be really wise about how many times you call a president and say, I need your help on something. You have to get through and navigate a campus on your own, but anytime I called on Bill, he would make the time to meet with me, and anytime I call on him, he would basically give me this very Bill-like philosophical read of where I was and the paths I needed to choose between going here and there, and say, now what do you think you should do? And I'll support you in whatever decision you make. And having leadership like that is extraordinary, and him, at the end of the day, what he believed was that our campus should have great art, and he always wanted to aim to the highest, and he was trusting me and the museum, saying, and our funders who were supporting it also saying, this is the project that if we get a chance to build it, we should realize it. And whatever gut instinct and belief he had in that, and kind of like in our capacity to get it done, but also just trusting us. And without him, without that kind of backing, it wouldn't have happened.
Mm-hmm. And I was so impressed also that together with him, that the university allocated funds towards the sort of conservation and maintenance of the building. And I think that seemed like Ellsworth and Jack were really moved by that, because that's not the kind of...
Well, Bill had very early on said, which is a big thing, the university would give $1 million to build the building, to help build it if you could get this done. And, obviously building the building is the first big step, and who knows how much it's going to cost. But I called Bill because we were trying to get Ellsworth to feel, and Jack to feel comfortable with this being the place to gift their concept to and to work with, because there was other potential partners around the country. And I called Bill and I said, Bill, I think it would make a big difference if you allow me to designate, because that's the only real money we had at the time, you allow me to designate that for an endowment for conservation instead. And he said, you have it. And for a president to do that's a big thing, right? Because then you still have out there to figure out how to pay for, right? We're putting a conservation endowment, can't even figure out how to pay for it yet.
Right.
But things like that, again, this is having a really great partner. And so, and then called over there, and I'd call, one time I asked Bill, I was like, Bill, I really need you to call Ellsworth and tell him you're committed to this. And in that whole, because we didn't have a relationship with Ellsworth, and so a lot of it came through conversations I was having or other people were having, but those key moments of having your president call over, I know it impressed Ellsworth a great deal. Having the kind of vision that we would be caring for it before we could even figure out how to build it, I think that mattered, and that the president was supporting that idea mattered.
And the day that we all went to the studio that Bill joined us at the studio for the first time, he later told Simone and me that it was really one of the best days of his tenure and most special days. So there were a lot of laughs that I think he enjoyed.
Yeah. I'd asked Bill if he'd go with me to deliver why we were there was to deliver the agreement, the final, after going through all the legalities, because obviously Ellsworth has a lawyer, we have lawyers, university, like going through and making sure this is a huge commitment, right? And I asked Bill if he'd go, and it was just going to be the two of us going up, and then it seemed like it was a more important moment to celebrate. And Jeannie and Mickey Klein, who are very important in this, I asked them if they'd go. Veronica went, and so there was a group of us that went, and And it was, and Bill told me it was the most special thing for him. It was incredibly special for me, and it meant a lot. And Bill was so excited to like carry the agreement up. He's like, I have the agreement, I won't lose it. And I was like, okay, don't lose the gift agreement. And that's when we actually, Ellsworth signs it, and it was a great moment. So
very special moment. And I wanted to talk about the early history of the project because, as some of you may know, Ellsworth conceived the project in the 1980s for a collector named Doug Kramer in the Santa Barbara area. And this was, Simone, you first heard about the project through...
So actually I had not, obviously I know exactly who Ellsworth Kelly was. I had never heard about this particular project. And the way I found out about it was through Jeannie Klein, who was in that last picture, who's on our board. And actually it might have been Annie Arnold, who's in this room. I'm in a meeting and she keeps knocking on the door saying, Jeannie Klein needs to talk to you. And I see my cell phone and Jeannie's calling my cell phone. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I hope somebody in the family didn't pass away, which is the first thing I'm thinking.
Right.
Anyway, I get called out of whatever emergency and it's like, there's this project. And I thought, well, this could have waited 10 minutes, but okay.
Yeah.
And actually, the very first way I truthfully kind of get any sense of it was through this essay that Carter Foster, who had written. And I read that and I try and get my hands on as much. I remember asking Annie, it was you, right? Yeah. And others in my office, because I tend to be very quiet about things until I'm ready to announce them. I said, don't ask me what this is for, but go to the UT library and get every Ellsworth Kelly book out, but don't tell them what you're doing. And she was like, I don't even know what I'm doing. And I said, that's good. And so she brought him back. And so I was trying to get as much read on the project as I could, but I think it's just wonderful that actually this essay was really important, and Carter is here today with us as part of the team. So it's a full circle.
Yeah, kind of beautiful. And then in terms of the history, which Carter outlines in this essay, Ellsworth was invited. The inspiration for the building came from an invitation from a private collector named Doug Kramer, who's based in New York, or based in the East Coast. And at the time, he was partnered with Aaron Spelling on Love Boat, and he was a really important producer and lots of shows that you would recognize. That's how he'd made his fortune. And he had a beautiful home in outside of Santa Barbara and wanted to have an artist design sort of chapel or space on the grounds, and spoke with Ellsworth. And Ellsworth was really thrilled by the idea, I think in part because of his history. He spent nearly 7 years living in Paris after World War II on the GI Bill, and France was really forged his interest in I think France was sort of a key place for him in terms of the time that he spent in churches and in Romanesque churches and cathedrals. And I know we're all thinking about Notre Dame right now. Those were the kinds of spaces that Ellsworth was bicycling to, and really struck by the amazing art and spiritual power of those spaces too. And so he was very excited about the project and really conceived the whole thing. It had a model. Here's the early model that he makes for Doug Kramer. Doesn't it look like it could be a model for our building, right? I mean, this is in the 1980s. And he designs the whole thing, but, very wisely presses pause, because he's like, what's going to happen when you move? He says to Doug Kramer, and Doug Kramer insists he'll never move, but guess what happens? Of course he moved. So who's going to maintain this building? Also, who's going to experience it? A very limited number of people. I think only 3 of us in the room have met Doug Kramer, right? Like, we're not all friends. We're not all going to go there. So I think, so Ellsworth was very excited about the idea, but they agree that it doesn't make sense on private grounds, and it's basically shelved as a project for decades until the Blanton, or until this sort of, and this is the question I think that we get, and we can talk a little bit more about how it's changed, how it's similar. These are just some of the early drawings that I wanted to share. This is Doug, and talk about...
We were in a very relaxed state.
Yeah.
This is Doug Kramer's home in Martha's Vineyard.
Yeah. And you ended up developing a bit of a relationship with him, which I think is also kind of beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, really towards the end of the project, and truthfully at the opening, he came to our opening celebration, and I invited him, and he sat next to me, and it meant a lot to me to hear him say during that opening night, he said this was exactly where it was meant to be. And he was so proud to see it here. He gifted, through that process, I had a few conversations with him on the phone before him coming here, some works that Ellsworth had drawn, had created out at his vineyard, where this was originally imagined to be. There were drawings of some of the grape leaves from his vineyard, and so I think that meaningful connection back. But he was really happy that it was here, and then Carter and I went up to visit with him after the opening to interview him for the website, and he said some really very meaningful things about the importance, just really kind of looking me it kind of almost made me want to cry when he was doing it, but telling us about how he hopes we understand what we had done for the world, not just for the museum, but for the arts in general, and the impact and how important this legacy was. So he, I think, is very grateful, and he's been incredibly kind to us, and it's kind of beautiful. He also was the producer of Wonder Woman, and there's just a side note, he told me my hair was like Wonder Woman hair, so I don't know, that might have been equal to like creating, like a image.
Oh my gosh. I love that. And it was so amazing to see him come to the museum. And, Ellsworth was part of a generation, he was in his late 80s when we embarked on this project. And I think we felt a real sense of urgency, especially with the bureaucracy that you've mentioned that a university has. I think we all felt an incredible sense of urgency. Like, if we're going to do this, we have to do this now, and we can't delay a single day because...
So she's not going to ask me this question, but when I first heard about this project, I was in the process of actually building my team, and have a director for I don't know how many months, not that long. I had to figure out what I was going to do with this museum. I remember when I first heard about it, I called a few people. Ray had been in that meeting, and our former curator Francesca came in, and I had been thinking about it for a while before then, but obviously doing something like this kind of pushes you, like everybody's on board. It's not just two people.
Right.
But I was in process of hiring a curator of modern contemporary art, and in these interviews and then my finalists, I would say, well, if there was a big project that you were basically asked to kind of be part of, how would you respond, and I remember asking Veronica that question, and she's like, well, what's the project? I was like, well, I can't tell you if you get the job here.
Right.
And so I think when you accepted, I was like, okay, so here's this project.
Yeah.
And then there was silence on the phone for a while.
It's like, wow.
But Veronica's role was incredibly important early on in building relationship with Ellsworth, and I want to make sure people know that.
Thank you. Yeah, that was pretty exciting. I had already accepted the job, but that was really thrilling to get to be part of it. And the question that people always ask us, and so I wanted to address it, is like, well, why Austin? Why the Blanton? Ellsworth has never even been to Austin, as far as I know. So how in the world did this project that was conceived for a collector in California end up here? I know you get asked that all the time, so I wanted to answer it.
The basics is we were told about the project by a dealer in Houston.
It's right here.
Hiram Butler, who's in the middle, who's an alum at UT, but that's part of the reason. I mean, the main reason is that he had heard about it. He was an Ellsworth dealer, and is not Matthew Marks in New York is, but he had heard about it, and he was smart enough to realize that there was extraordinarily timeliness to this project. Ellsworth at that time was 88, I think.
Yeah.
And he heard about it, I think, like late in the summer of 2012, and he kind of took it to a couple different institutions, and it happened to come to us as a kind of, word of mouth, him mentioning it to some of the Kleins, and eventually the Kleins mentioned it to me, and there was this very brief conversations. But so that's how we learn about it. But how this actually ends up happening is just, courting and building relationship and spending the money and time, which is truthfully very risky for any institution, and one that was in the process of building a team and trying to figure out where we were headed, of hiring an architect and thinking about this very strategically. There was a good maybe year and a half or two before we signed the gift agreement that I was spending a lot of time working on this. And, it could have been that Ellsworth, for whatever reason, or Jack Shearer, who's really important, would decide this is not the right place, and those are the risks you take. Like, that's kind of, it's like we were dating. And then we just, we hit it off.
Yeah.
And we got married.
Yeah, absolutely. And here you're just seeing a really early model that's 3D printed on the UT grounds. And this is just an early studio visit with Ellsworth. We're talking through the project and the space. And I think, one of the challenges with working with an 88-year-old artist, I mean, he was so vibrant, so completely at the top of his game. I remember when we were having dinner with him one night, you and I excused ourselves thinking it was time to leave. It's 9:30, and he insisted on,
Yeah, I was like, oh, this is going to be an early evening, go back to the hotel and rest. And it was 10 o'clock. I'm like, when is this?
He wouldn't let us leave.
Stop. And he was telling jokes. And I was tired. I was like, I guess I better not be tired.
Yeah, you can't be more tired than an 88-year-old.
No.
So
it's embarrassing.
So he had just an incredible amount of energy, but he was on oxygen. He had health issues, so he couldn't fly during any portion of this project. So one of the challenges was, okay, we're going to try to make this happen, but we're going to try to make it happen on a campus he can't visit. And so the role of being kind of intermediary with the studio was really important. And so you were flying back and forth. I did some studio visits as well. But can you talk about even how the site was chosen? Because he was given lots of options.
Yeah.
How do you do that?
So, and I'll wrap in a little bit of the prior question too that's important. There was a few things, the University of Texas broadly could have, built it perhaps, but what mattered to him a great deal is that it was going to be part of a museum's collection. So you could imagine there'd be other foundations around the world, or it could have been, in some national park. The fact that it would be part of a museum's collection mattered. So the closeness to the Blanton and it being accession into our collection, so a museum that is, following, kind of collection management rules was very important. So that kind of starts defining the site. He would love the fact that students would be around it. He loved the fact that this was a museum that was growing, and Austin seemed, cool broadly.
Yeah.
And actually choose to name it for the city of Austin. And this was, I won't get to that. But so the site gets to be right by the Blanton. That's key. And that process of going up there back and forth is, and sometimes I truthfully a lot actually ended up happening on phone calls and shipping samples and calling and saying which way do you want to go. So it was a very, very intense process of once we kind of sorted everything out, and again the formal, I can't remember exactly, but I think the formal gift agreement doesn't come till towards the end of this, when we agree to what we're building. But there's quite a bit of time when you're involved in early visits, and then we get into this very intense time when it switches over to kind of a very building-like phase, and this is the process that I'm leading intensely with a large team. I'm just, show up and look good at the end, but there's a large team of the architects and the builders and UT and our own team here, where we're thinking through how to build every aspect of the building, so taking it in parts, and I would send up to Ellsworth and to the studio, what about solving the wall coursing outside in this way, and then he would kind of, I'd call that next week, and then I'd get feedback of yes, option A. Sometimes it was option A, B, or C, and then he'd say B, or sometimes he'd say none of those. How about more this way? And so we'd take it back to the team, and it was extraordinarily rigorous process. And that was the way that he was getting a chance to do feedback, and also we'd send materials, and that way he could see what we were talking about visually, and he could push us in different directions to look for materials or design options for him.
And I'm so grateful that he chose the Blanton for all the reasons that you mentioned, but also because as somebody who is not from Austin, it took me 2 years to not need a map when I walk around this campus, because all the buildings look exactly the same. So even when you have a map, it's hard to find. So I think symbolically of course it made sense. We're going to be the custodians of this building, but also to have it on the edge of campus, facing the city, facing the Capitol, it made sense. And
he loved the idea I was going to face the Capitol.
Yeah, I think that is. And I thought there was also also one of the things that we would remark on in the process, it was interesting how much he paid attention, in spite of not having been here, how thoughtful he was about the needs of the students and the campus. So I remember when he chose the site, he was very careful for the building not to be further to the left, because he had heard us talk about Jester Beach, and how students would play Frisbee on this hill to the left. And he's like, I really don't want that to be, I do not want to interfere with the Frisbees. I mean, and just like, who thinks that way? Like, and he did.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
And one other thing I'll say is that through that whole process, again, back to those people who you just can't get something done without them, Jack Shear was incredibly important in that whole. I mean, it would not have happened without Jack Shear.
Absolutely. He's become an honorary Texan. But one of the things that's so fascinating to me about this project, if any of you are familiar with somebody like James Turrell, there's a Sky Space on campus. He's an artist. There are about 88 Sky Spaces in the world. There's only one Ellsworth Kelly building. And for an artist who is considered a master of color, who's perfected, worked in oil painting or acrylic painting, and really one of the great colorists of the 20th and 21st century, to create a building where, with so many firsts, it's a first building, it's the first stained glass he'd ever worked with, it's the first marble panels. So, and to do this all sort of towards the end of your career, the twilight of your career, is such an amazing opportunity, but I would also think is kind of daunting. Like, how do you work in materials that are new for the first time? And I just wanted to talk and ask you a little bit about, since you went to the stained glass factory in Munich, the fabricators, how, watching Ellsworth go through this process of, what was his, can you just describe a little bit that experience and what you observed in terms of like the glass in particular? Maybe we can start there.
Well, I guess there's maybe two things I want to say about the glass. I mean, there's a million things I could say about the glass, because obviously to me, that, I don't know, it's so much of the building that makes it so extraordinary. But one is the process that we needed to get there. So how did Ellsworth figure this out, and kind of some of the comments he made in the studio. Because he couldn't travel, he couldn't go to the fabricator in Munich. That's where the fabricator was. So they set up his studio, and again, yes, a huge team working on this. His team at his studio set up this little garage door where he could look at samples and then kind of respond to the colors he's seeing. Michael Meyer, who is the one of the owners of this company, family-run company, is that's Ellsworth looking. That was Veronica looking at some of those windows. So it flew out there a few times, and they kept sending samples. They kept fine-tuning and fine-tuning and fine-tuning. At some point, it's handed over to this extraordinary glass fabricator in Munich. And if anybody ever goes to Munich, if you can get in and get a chance to get a tour, it's not necessarily open to the public. But at some point, it's handing over that kind of craft making to them. But Ellsworth was very clear about some of these things. Like he didn't want the glass to look too sheer. He wanted it to look textured. The richness of kind of the hue and kind of the depth of the colors across the board was, at some point, the fabricators had to figure it out. He called for his colors, but then how do you manage that with light shining through? And I remember Ellsworth at one point, he picked up the things and he's like, oh, I guess, it was like kind of this realization of a sense of control, these colors that he'd always kind of managed and control with paint, and opaque surfaces, all of a sudden start shifting, like the hues, the tones would look correct on the table, and you pick it up and the yellow was transparent. And just that process was an extraordinary process to watch, and to just see this man that was so sharp. I mean, talk about shaming you about, your own little complaints in the world, and you'd see somebody so alive and working at that age and just clear. But the other part of it that again, to the unicorn of a project and the just little tie-ins and amazing things like, Carter's essay at the beginning and then being here today, because of the way UT works, it's very complicated to build a building at the end of the day, which is what we were doing. and the way you go through purchasing and doing all these things, and the way it kind of all sits in, there was only one firm that could really produce this for us. But if I'd waited to go through the way things had to get through, that would have never have happened, because the glass, we wouldn't have been able to hire those glass fabricators until 3 years later. Ellsworth would have, truthfully not been around or able to do it. So I went to the studio, Michael Meyer, early on, and I hope he doesn't mind me saying this, but I actually asked him if he would just work for free for R&D and, be my partner on this. And I said, I promise we'll get this done. I just can't, I can't give you a contract right now. I just need you to go through this R&D process with us. And he did, and he understood the significance. This was an extraordinarily important project, and again, you just, take risks in helping an artist kind of help find their vision, and I think you do the best work, and it comes together in the end, so.
Yeah, and, but it is so amazing to think about the light that would pass through these windows, because as you see from the studio, and we seem to only ever go there in February or January when it was freezing and there was no light, but to Texas light is different than, upstate New York light where his studio is, so it was just a huge challenge to figure this out, and particular colors, I think, he really wrestled with.
But, the thing I'm remembering the first time, so you can't see it in this picture as well, but there's some others, but you can kind of see it on his hand and a little bit on the floor, so there's a concrete floor there, and I remember the first time the light hit the floor, and he, like Ellsworth, was just thrilled. You can see how that shadowing would start to happen, and it was just a really thrilling moment, and it was thrilling to see him see that beauty of that, and obviously he doesn't get to see it in his final building here, but I mean, obviously this was his full idea and his imagination, so clearly he knew exactly what we were going to see. But being able to see a kind of live little model of it and seeing that change, I think, was really important and incredibly meaningful.
Absolutely, and the model just doesn't prepare you for that. Like, I think that's the thing that I was most struck by when the building opened, was just the way the light passes through and is refracted onto the floor and onto the wall. And
But one day with the model in his studio, we sat there, we were trying to figure out what the sun would do, and so we were sitting there with a flashlight, and it was just ridiculous because we're all standing around this little model. It was kind of this extraordinary experience of putting a flashlight through and going like that, but and this is the first time we see the glass here in Texas light, truthfully. So we had a mock-up in the garage over there, that parking garage that some of you
Brazos
love.
has never,
And so we did a
little to
little
love about that
mock-up with
place.
some of our installation team, and that's Michael Meyer, who's the from the Franz Meyer Glass, and then Jack and installation team at the museum, setting up a mock-up so we could. And actually, this was a really important meeting because they realized, Jack and Ellsworth realized for the first time that we were creating one pane of glass, and that's what Michael was, the assumption was, and we all had this assumption, and that's where realized, and Ellsworth said, no, I wanted glass colored on front and back, and so they had to go, in a sense, go back to the drawing board, because we just slightly figured out all the colors with one single pane, and then realizing the depth of the building, we needed to create two panes. So you can imagine, how do you get the same colors with now multiple layers, extra layers?
Yeah, and one of the things that you mentioned that I think is really important is the way Ellsworth kept emphasizing the touch of the hand, and sort of, so if you've been inside the building, when you've looked at the glass, it looks almost like the surface of water, like a lake, and you can tell it's not a sheer, as you put it, sort of a sheer manufactured, machine made. It's clearly hand blown, and there's some amazing, Carter interviewed Michael Meyer for the website, which I mentioned will be coming out in May, and there's some amazing footage of him showing how the glass was made, but it just has, there was so much of a human touch, and one of the few other changes I wanted to mention, so the building was originally going to be stucco. One of the few things that changed, like the vision, Ellsworth's vision was very far along, so there were not that many changes. Like, that early model looks like our building, but it was going to be stucco, and as you all know, stucco works great in Santa Barbara. It would not work. It would crack in like 4 seconds in Texas. And also white, if you've ever been to the Getty, that building hurts my eyes. Like, if you don't have sunglasses and you go to the Getty and it's a sunny day in LA, like, good luck to you. You'll probably need to see an eye doctor doctor afterwards. So white stucco would not have been appropriate. And so Ellsworth immediately understands that he's going to have to translate it into stone. And we can talk about the stone that he chose. But one of the things I thought was very interesting is that the architect on record, Overland Partners in San Antonio, they had mocked up sort of some diagrams for him showing the stone laid out in a Cartesian grid, which is basically like a perfect grid, right? Like a graph paper type of grid. And Ellsworth immediately said, no, that's not what I want. It needs to be irregular. I want it to have the feel of, an 11th century or 12th century French church. And the stone should be, because a regular grid, I mean, it was just these moments, these choices he was making. A regular grid would have been like corporate feeling, and that was really not where this was coming from. So those sorts of distinct, like he was so clear about those kinds of touches, I thought.
He was very clear about it, but also, when you're building something, and he was also very respectful that he hadn't built a building, right? Like he didn't,
Wasn't an
air
architect.
Conditioning was not something he was thinking about. And we informed him we needed AC, and he said, why? And we said, it's Texas.
Take
so
our word.
he found out there was going to be a basement, and he's like, what do you need a basement for? It's like, that's where the air conditioning go. But that process of kind of, understanding how far and what's really needed and where you can push it. And I think that was an important role that the museum played in trying, or at least I felt a really important role for me to play in listening and figuring out where to push and where to say, no, this really is something that has to get done elsewhere. Then I think there was a real trust between us and that I was really trying to hear what he was, oh gosh, take another picture of someone else. But the stone early on, it was not just the grid, but they were looking at some darker stones, and they were having a hard time finding lighter stones. And while he wasn't going to have his white stucco building, he still kind of was holding on to that. And he kept kept hearing that he wasn't happy about that. There was a few other things where, some architectural design decisions that were being, were requirements. It's just like, can we push it? Can we push it? And he was so generous and very clear. He was super clear, like you got an answer like that. It was also, and Jack was too in the process, but also, there was no kind of like dramatic, it was kind of like understanding and respectful of process. But there was times where I just, like the color of the stone, I kept hearing him not happy. And so, really asked the architects, you just need to do another search. You need to find something. And they went back and found more stones and eventually found one that was, and actually presented something that was white, and he actually didn't want it. He actually loved this stone. Yeah. And it was like, actually, this is it. And once he saw it, he knew that's what he wanted. And it was a gorgeous a limestone from Alicante, Spain. And again, another part of this was like, I never assumed we knew or the architects knew or any of us knew what Ellsworth would want. I'd always like make sure, like I kind of felt like I was starting to feel his decisions, but I never assumed that. I'd always check with with him or the studio. But I would try and like hear for little things. Like this was out in the quarry, and I was standing there and I was there with Jack, and we were basically just, verifying that the selection of the stone from the rock, that the piece from the bed that they had cut was correct, and how they were carving it, and these were tests that they carved, and the rest of the group went out, and I was standing, I think this is my picture, I was standing behind taking pictures, and I overheard them talking about how they were going to cut the edges, and one guy was telling another guy, from the manager was telling him that you needed to round the corner of the edges, and I was like, no. And so I went and got Jack. I said, Jack, Ellsworth wouldn't want rounded corners. I mean, I knew that would be the answer, but I needed to hear. And so we stood around actually and brought the whole team back and talked about making sure that the edges were cut, not like this, not like that, not, perfect, straight down, little things. But I think those things really mattered. And I think also not assuming, like I never ever said, no, that's what Ellsworth would want. I'd always check with Ellsworth or later on with the studio. I think that was really important to make sure it was what, Ellsworth's building.
And even though he passed away before it was completed, he knew construction had already begun, and he weighed in on, didn't he weigh in on
yeah,
everything?
So there's only two little decisions that happened after he passed away that weren't really decisions we were hoping to make. It was actually a sourcing of material that we just had to figure out something, and every single thing. I mean, he was very clear that he didn't want to claim he designed the light raft or the,
Right.
but still weighed in on everything from where the outlets would go and the color of the outlets on the floor and the coursing that we sent up samples of how the grout would sit in the stone. Like, is it flush? Is it back? Is it sanded? Is it not sanded? Like, of the 10 colors narrowed down to 4, which one do you want? Everything. So, whether there were decisions, some of the decisions they'd say, well, some of this is for you to figure out, like security cameras, but I was respectful in sending everything so he could understand what was happening. If we were going to have a fire code thing, it's not your choice, but this is going there. So there's not a detail in the building he didn't know was happening. There's a couple little things like sourcing of the stone in the end. There was a veining issue later on that we made a decision on to get what he was looking for, but that's just because from the time you source to the time you build. But they were small things. So.
Yeah, and like the benches, we're still working on the benches, but that was one of the few things. It's amazing that he weighed in on everything. And I realize we don't have photos of this is somewhat of the construction. I'm going to open things up to Q&A in just a second, but
can I say one other thing about that last picture of the wood? Just because I think there's so many little miracles in this building. Just kind of like the glass. I mean, the partners trusting us because they could have just looked at me and said, "Are you kidding? Like, come back when you have some money, lady."
Right.
But also the wood was the very first conversation I had with Jack Shear. He said, "So, do you think this is going to get done?" And I said, "Jack, that's my hope." And he said, "Well, they just found a couple redwoods in a riverbed, and he's like, what do you?" And I said, "Well, I can't pay for them, but it'd be really great if you could hold them." And he said he was going to do that automatically. But if that had not happened in that moment, there wouldn't have been enough time for them to dry out,
right? To cure, they call it curing.
To exactly when we needed to carve them. And I just think it was all meant to be here.
Yeah, you're right. And that was a very emotional moment when they brought the redwood. It's unstained, untreated. It's the most beautiful totem Ellsworth ever made. I'll scroll back to a photo of it, but and the wood really adds something so much to the building, I think. Sorry, there's a lot of scrolling, but there's a totem that's in upstate New York, but the totem is really kind of extraordinary.
It's extraordinary.
I was not prepared for how important that was going to feel to the building. And I think it's so interesting that when you walk into the building, everything's kind of black, white, and gray, unless you're getting the drama of a 9 a.m.
The 10:11 today.
Yeah, 10:11 today. And then you turn around and it's sort of like this world changes. But all right, well, I want to end our conversation here just so that we have plenty of time for Q&A. I can ask some more questions if need be, but I have a feeling people might have some of their own. But so any questions from all of you about and show of hands, how many of you have actually been in the space yet? Okay, that seemed like pretty much everyone. Okay, great. So any questions from all of you? And thank you for visiting, first of all.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So what can you tell me about the live oak doors?
While we were trying, so just about the front doors and the material, the wood itself. So we were going through the process of designing, or the architects were, doors that might be what Ellsworth was looking for. And again, he was trying to capture that sense of these great, Romanesque Gothic churches in France, where he spends his time in the 40s, Notre Dame being one of them, and many other great institutions, churches. And so he wanted that feel, and so we were they had to be thick, and so we were trying to source all this wood, and then we heard from somebody on campus, one of our colleagues on the project, that there was a live oak that was needing to be, that was going to possibly be available because of the medical school. And so we sent samples up, and we said, after we'd gone through all this other sourcing of wood, and we sent it up, and he just loved the idea that it would be a local tree, and that it would be a live oak.
Very heavy doors, you probably noticed. Yeah, Jeannie.
I have a question. So the marble Stations of the Cross.
Yeah.
How are those hung on the walls? And did he make those himself in upstate New York, or were they also made in the space?
So those in the redwood totem were fabricated by Carlson, now Baker Carlson, I think has just changed. John Baker and Peter Carlson worked with us. They had worked with Ellsworth for many years, like decades, on fabricating some of their large sculptures. And so they were the ones that fabricated them in the end. And the marble was sourced from Italy. The white was from Carrara, and the black is from Belgium. There was actually in that design process, so this is where some of it was about, boring things like outlets. More important conversations were capturing what Ellsworth's decisions were, and so we sent up, and in that case it was Carlson as well as us, how far he would want it off the wall, and he had a mock-up in the studio, and they agreed, and I remember asking, I asked a lot of questions just to make sure I fully understood. I remember we got this kind of specs from the studio, and that this is what Ellsworth had approved. There had been a mock-up, and I said, well, and I kind of questioned the light hitting it from above, because once we started looking at the light that was coming down, that it was going to cast a little bit of a shadow. And I said, "Are you sure that's latest Ellsworth?" And it was yes, of course. But I just thought it was important to understand that. So he even knew that there'd be a little bit of shadow kind of coming off. I mean, he wanted diffused light, and that's why I asked the question, because he wanted all the light to be really diffused and not have anything with spotlights. But them being off the wall was important, which is part of his practice anyway, but that was important in the design of the building to kind of support that.
So how is that achieved? I mean, maybe this is a very specific and technical question, but how is that achieved? Because you do get a sense of
Floating.
yeah.
There's a kind of metal bracket that sits behind it, and and it sits down in it, and then the walls were actually designed structurally so that there would be a support system to be exactly where he wanted it. So all of that, again, that's why it's important to understand that this is a kind of complete work of art. It's like we would never, of course, the museum, and that was part of the gift agreement. They wanted to make sure that we weren't going to take these things off, and then suddenly hang something else in there. And obviously that wasn't the intention. The intention, and we thought through it exactly where the support system for the totem would go, and that had to be exactly thought through in the design process early on, how the windows would sit, where they sit back, or they sit exactly in. And so it is, kind of a jewel as it is, and that's, it was all thought through to support his vision.
Interestingly enough, they were, in the Kramer building, they were going to be inset into the wall.
Yeah.
So that's a major change because you wanted them to feel permanent in that building because you were worried about what that was going to do.
So what Carter so that was actually allowed, truthfully, Ellsworth, I think, here to kind of do what he really wanted to do, have them offset, because the idea of putting them in was a little bit more out of concern that might the caretaker of this work of art kind of disassemble it, and or whoever else owns it. And here he had more of the freedom to create it as he wanted, because we're committed to obviously keeping this as a complete work of art.